Welcome back, everybody. And hello to those of you who join us for the first time for the second part of the 2021 International Wisdom Summit. We have an exciting program for you guys. We have Flash Talks, awards. We have a session on culture and cultural diversity and its role for understanding what wisdom is, as well as some wrap up and some ideas for future directions. I will not spend much time on riff caching and introducing. I will just direct you to already existing program from the first part of the day that is on YouTube, and you can follow. Just as a reminder, please mute yourself in case you're not muted, unless you are the presenter. And that's all. We will have now first the Flash Talks. And I will pass on to my colleague, Nick Weststrate, who will moderate the session.
Thank you, Igor. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who are with us this morning or earlier today, and welcome into our new attendees. My name is Nick Weststrate, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second and final Early Career Scholar Flash Talk session of our conference. So for those of you who are new to this concept, Flash Talks are very quick opportunities for researchers and scholars, in this case from around the globe and in many different time zones, to share just a glimpse of their incredible work in 4 minutes or less. In this session, we will hear from 8 Flash Talk presenters in 45 minutes. Throughout the talks, as Igor said, please keep your videos turned off, your audio on mute. If time permits, we'll have a Q&A period at the end, at which point you can turn your videos on. I encourage you to post your questions in the chat, and throughout the session, I invite the presenters to respond to those questions in writing if possible. And at the end of the session, I will pull questions from the chat to ask of the speakers. And when asking your question, please provide the name of the presenter you're addressing. That would be helpful. We are very grateful to the Center for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago, who has generously provided prizes for the top 3 Flash Talks. We'll announce these awards at the end of the conference during our closing remarks, so please stick around. Now, with no further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce our first presentation, which is titled Symbolic Leadership Paying Wellbeing Dividends, an assessment of perceptions regarding how leaders respond during crises.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Svea, and I'll be presenting on behalf of my University of Queensland team comprising Justin, Bernard, and Ali. What makes constituents believe that their leaders are great? Is it because their leader possesses wise leadership qualities? Or is it because a leader is perceived to have wise leadership qualities? Is this a difference with a distinction? Leaders' decisions, both wise and unwise, impact the reality of their constituents. But do leaders also serve a symbolic function? Do the perceptions of a leader's wisdom during a crisis induce a sense of security, resilience, and hope within their constituents? Let's look at a current example of why perceptions matter. The New South Wales Premier's respectability and performance for her responses during the COVID crisis were deemed as very commendable. However, last week she resigned. Why? Because she unwisely failed to disclose a conflict of interest. This lapse completely changed how the New South Wales constituents felt they were coping with the difficult situation of an extended state lockdown. There is no research that has looked at how constituents' perceptions of their leaders provide increments to their well-being during and following crisis points in time. This is the focus of our research. We conducted a correlational study where we asked participants to reflect on the leader that was closest to them personally and rate how wise they were. We then asked them about their own personal well-being. These were the results. The first chart shows their retrospective well-being a year ago, during the height of the first wave of the pandemic. The second graph shows their current well-being. Both graphs show that the responders' perceptions of their political leaders having and showing wisdom positively related to the responders' subjective and objective standing. The cross-sectional study was limited by response bias, and there's no evidence of causality. However, these limitations were addressed in our longitudinal study. The results of the longitudinal study showed that the constituents' beliefs, specifically regarding President Trump's wisdom at the height of the pandemic, so mid to late June 2020, matched their subjective well-being both before and after the third election. What is interesting is that these results occurred regardless of the objective outcome. What this suggests is that leaders serve an important symbolic function in building morale, hope, and resiliency within their constituents, especially during crises, if their constituents see them as having and showing wisdom. So what is the takeaway from this presentation? Mere perceptions of a leader's wisdom can provide well-being dividends, regardless of whether they are actually wise. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Svea. Our next talk, I invite Trish to share her slides. The talk is titled Generativity in Informal Life Review, Discovering Life Lessons and Wisdom in Naturalistic Intergenerational Conversations.
Hi, my name is Trish Chilton. I'm from the University of Arizona Department of Psychology, and I'm honored to be here today in the presence of such minds in the realm of wisdom research. My talk will discuss the development of a coding scheme as part of my master's project to examine life lessons in intergenerational conversations and identifying wisdom characteristics in these life lessons. As many of you know, generativity is the process of older adults passing on knowledge and wisdom to younger generations. This is often done through informal life review and may include redemptive qualities as expressed through life lessons. But in order for generativity to occur, opportunities for intergenerational relationships must exist. Despite evidence that there is great value in these relationships, age segregation and ageism persist in our societies. Therefore, we wanted to capture the value in these interactions, particularly in unscripted natural conversations, by seeing if older adults practice generativity by including life lessons in this type of exchange, and if so, to what extent do these life lessons convey wisdom? The data we used was taken from a study done through an adult development and aging course, where 52 facility-dwelling older adults were interviewed by college students on 3 separate occasions for about an hour each visit. The only question asked was, "Tell me about your life. Tell me about yourself." For the current sample, we randomly chose 5 older adults whose average age was 87. This represents the oldest old age group, an understudied cohort, and happens to be the fastest growing age group in the United States. The 15 hours of recorded interviews were listened to, and life lessons were extracted from the narratives. A coding scheme was developed to examine life lessons that included emotional valence, wisdom, life lesson type, and autobiographical memory type. Today, I will focus on wisdom. The wisdom characteristics were chosen based on a review of the wisdom literature and include openness, resilience, pro-social behaviors, emotion regulation, reflectivity, and pragmatic knowledge. From the interviews, 64 total life lessons were identified and coded by myself and the author of the original study. The coding was then checked for inter-rater reliability. Preliminary findings demonstrate lots of variability. variability in number of life lessons per participant. We see that subject 1 has 11 life lessons and subject 5 has 20 life lessons, and variability among wisdom characteristics, particularly resilience, as we see in green. One could speculate that this may be due to culture or varying types of life experiences. We do, however, see consistency in pragmatic knowledge, as seen in the orange, but the most consistency is seen in reflectivity, represented by the dark blue bars, and is cited the most at 44 times. Some of the components of reflectivity in our definition include self-insight, self-awareness, acknowledging growth and life lessons, having intellectual humility, seeing oneself as part of a larger whole. To conclude, this project demonstrates that life lessons are indeed being shared in naturalistic intergenerational conversations. And we see that reflectivity is the most consistent wisdom characteristic, followed by pragmatic knowledge. Further investigation, however, is needed to see how these exchanges involving wisdom benefit older and younger individuals. The remaining 47 interviews continue to be coded as part of my dissertation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trish. For our next talk is titled Limited Compassion Mindsets Also Limit Moral Expansiveness, an example of how beliefs about emotions can influence moral outcomes.
I'm not muted anymore. Okay, let's try that again.
Yeah, you're good.
Awesome, thank you. So prior research in psychology suggests that compassion might be limited. This includes research on compassion fatigue and the collapse of compassion. And some of our prior research suggests that people have lay beliefs about whether compassion is a relatively limited or unlimited resource. So for instance, a sample item on our scale is feeling compassion for others exhausts your resources, which you need to refuel afterwards. So our research question was, does having a limited compassion mindset also limit moral expansiveness? Moral expansiveness is the idea that some people consider some entities closer to themselves in terms of psychological distance, whereas other entities are further away and they have less moral concern for those entities. And we reasoned that having a limited compassion mindset might lead people to think that they have to make trade-offs as it regards who they can extend compassion to and who they can't, and that this trade-off thinking might lead people to have lower overall levels of moral expansiveness. So in a first study, we just explored whether trying to manipulate people's mindsets about whether compassion is limited affected people's moral expansiveness. And in this study, participants wrote an essay about whether they had an experience with compassion being limited or compassion being relatively unlimited. They were randomly assigned to one of those two conditions, and those in the unlimited condition had higher levels of moral expansiveness. And in a second study, we did something similar, but this time we had them listen to a podcast that we created called Fast Feels, and they were randomly assigned to listen to an episode about compassion being a limited or unlimited resource. And in this study, people in the unlimited condition once again had higher levels of moral expansiveness, and a mediation model suggested that it was because that people in that condition were less likely to think about compassion in terms of involving trade-offs. So the implications of this work are that it identifies a potential antecedent to moral expansiveness. It demonstrates that lay beliefs about emotions can affect morally relevant outcomes. It identifies a potential for intervention, and it also suggests that the scientific ideas which we conveyed through our podcast have the power to affect morally important outcomes. So I'd like to thank my collaborator and the Julia Lee Cunningham and the conference for having me give this talk.
Thank you very much, Izzy. So for our next talk is titled, Most Wisdom Researchers Are Interested in Sagehood, Not Wisdom. While you set up Jinsung, I'll just remind everyone that to please take advantage of the chat function to ask questions of your presenters who will answer along the way, and also we can revisit those at the end.
Sorry, apologies. I think it did the thing again where it's showing the wrong screen.
No, it looks perfect, Jinsung.
Okay, good. Phew. Okay, we had that problem earlier. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Jinsung Kim. I am a PhD candidate in developmental psychology and education at the University of Toronto. And today I will be attempting to convince you all that many of us are actually interested in sagehood, not wisdom. So in a 2020 paper, our esteemed host, Igor Grossman, as well as Anna Dorfman and Harrison Oakes, lay out a couple of cases for why they think person-centered wisdom research is seriously flawed. I go over the arguments as I understand them in the slides. In the interest of time, I won't go through the entire thing. But let me just say, I agree with, I think, most of their points, but there's 2 points that I don't think hold, or at least aren't necessarily the case. The first one, which I think comes from their first of 2 arguments, I don't think person-centered research need to be dependent on scales. This is kind of a charge frequently leveled at person-centered wisdom research. It's not wrong in its entirety, but I think the arguments that Dr. Grossman has made for why scale-based research is maybe questionable work equally as well as an argument for doing more qualitative research. The second, and I think the possibly more controversial argument that I want to raise is I don't think many of us who study person-centered wisdom research are interested in studying wisdom as Dr. Grossman and colleagues define it, as a capacity that varies from situation to situation based on socio-ecological factors. So, of course, the question rises, what are we studying? So it is true that social context can determine much of a given individual's ability to reason wisely. However, I think that there is still a clear difference between individuals who are able to perform wisely in only a few contexts, for example, somebody who is safe, warm, comfortable, and somebody who is able to be wise in many different circumstances, under extreme adversity, when deathly ill, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the question in such cases is not the capacity for wise reasoning, which, as we heard this morning, can be taken as just a natural capacity that all humans share. But what personal factors, what life histories, what traits can prevent such ability to reason wisely from being affected by context? And it's these factors that I think are are of interest to many of us who do person-centered wisdom research, not the ability to reason wisely, but the ability to keep reasoning wisely. So I'd like to propose that this collection of personal constraints on wisdom is possibly more accurately referred to as sagehood or sagacity, depending on how you want to phrase it, and that this is really the proper object of person-centered wisdom research. The figure of the sage appears in most, if not all, classical wisdom traditions that I'm familiar with as a paradigmatic exemplar, somebody who possesses all the virtues, wisdom, courage, grace, et cetera, et cetera. Ideas of the achievability of sagehood vary from culture to culture, but it's usually held to be more of a compass point, but I don't think that's more of a problem. So, the question rises, can we find sages? Probably not. This has been a problem with exemplar-based wisdom research in the past. Several people have commented on it, including our esteemed host. But some people are still probably closer to the ideal than others, and such people I think are worth studying. So I think that refocusing the person-centered study of wisdom, not on wisdom or wise reasoning, but on sagehood as so defined, would have some beneficial consequences. One, I think it would help us bypass a lot of the current dispositional debate in wisdom research, with sagehood as the disposition, wisdom as the occurrent factor. I think it would also direct person-centered wisdom researchers to use richer qualitative methods, case studies, even experience sampling, working with these kind of rarer types of individuals. It could also help us with the problem of the unity of the virtues, which came up this morning. If you study somebody who hopefully has many virtues, you can study how they relate to each other. And finally, I think it would help afford better integration of psychological and philosophical stage theories of the development of wisdom and other virtues, psychosocial stage theories, the Junzi stage distinction of Confucian philosophy, and the rest. I will end it there. Thank you for your time and hopefully your thoughts. If you have thoughts, examples of sages, please get in touch. There's my email.
Thank you very much, Jinsun. All right, that marks our halfway point. We're doing great with time. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next talk. Melanie, so you can pull up. Oh, sorry, it's Jordan. Jordan, you can pull up your slides. Here, the talk is titled Generating a Theory of Wisdom Development in Medicine. Take it away, Jordan.
Yes, thank you so much for having me and for this wonderful conference. Within the context of medical education and practice, we believe that there are opportunities for wisdom development given its proximity to critical incidents that involve death and fundamental issues of human life. In a previously described model of post-traumatic growth related to medicine, there is a critical or traumatic incident which is defined as a challenging, disturbing, or influential life event that can lead to growth if supportive factors are present, like reflection or mentorship. And while it is possible to develop wisdom through critical incidents, not every circumstance necessarily leads to wisdom. Thus, it is important to understand what those supportive factors are. And despite the high prevalence of critical incidents in medicine, few studies have explored this wisdom development broadly. And the few studies that currently exist only focus on the immediate aftermath of medical errors. Given this gap, our aims were to understand how physicians define wisdom, to identify what critical incidents may lead to wisdom development, and to identify supportive factors that lead to physician growth and wisdom development, as well as the barriers that might prevent it. To do this study, an interview script was generated via literature review. We sampled faculty members from the Department of Medicine at University of Chicago, Stanford, and the University of Washington, accounting for sex, age, and institution. Invitation emails were sent to 104 faculty members in May, to which 20 responded and 19 agreed to participate in the interview. The interviews were recorded, transcribed, and anonymized. And after the interview, participants were also emailed the 3-dimensional wisdom scale to complete. The interviews were qualitatively analyzed, and codes and themes were generated via iterative review using a thematic analysis approach until consensus was reached. And from these codes, a theory about wisdom development in medicine will be generated as soon as the data analysis is complete. And in the future, this theory can be put to the test through prospective intervention studies in the context of medical education and residency. And we found that physicians highly prize wisdom, with many subjects referring to the wisdom of master clinicians and feeling that wisdom is needed to best treat patients. Still, our participants identified many barriers to wisdom development in medicine, most of which are tied to cultural or systemic issues rather than barriers due to workflow or the daily routines of practice. I would like to especially focus your attention on the code restricting environment as a barrier to wisdom. Some participants suggested here that the environment of practicing, and especially of learning medicine, is opposed to the expression of many factors needed to grow in wisdom, such as a safe space to share vulnerability, emotion, and mistakes. And some participants even went so far as to say that they felt a lack of psychological safety while learning or practicing medicine because learners are so scrutinized and held under a rigid hierarchy that they do not feel safe expressing opinions or elements of their character. And this may lead to an inability to receive appropriate feedback or have a meaningful mentorship relationship. Notably, both of these things, engagement in feedback and mentorship, were elements that subjects identified as being important to developing wisdom. You can also note that in the aftermath of a critical incident, participants told us that they were able to gain wisdom through informal or cultural elements, like feeling that they had space to recover after a difficult patient encounter, feeling that they had permission to share emotion and space to be vulnerable, and being able to engage in reflection with colleagues, friends, and themselves. On an encouraging note, we did encounter something that one participant called death rounds, where attending physicians and learners gathered for the sole purpose of discussing how difficult patient encounters and deaths made them feel and how they are dealing with that. So thankfully, there are interventions to cultivate wisdom out there. This all indicates, though, that it is medicine's own culture more than the work itself, despite how difficult the work may be, that poses an immense barrier to cultivating wise physicians. But fortunately, this also identifies key points in which curriculum and cultural reform can take place, setting the stage for future work and testing interventions. So I'd be happy to speak to any of these other elements if you have questions, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Our next talk is titled Adaptive and Maladaptive Coping in the Face of Trauma. I'll pass it over to you, Melanie.
Thanks. Just give me a minute to share my screen here.
Sure.
All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. So thank you for virtually attending our Flashtalk presentation. My name is Melanie Monroe, and I'm a PhD candidate studying developmental psychology and education at the University of Toronto, OISE. So today I'll be presenting on adaptive versus maladaptive coping in the face of trauma. So trauma can negatively impact one's mental health and personal functioning. In order to deal with trauma, individuals find ways to manage their symptoms and thoughts through proactive coping strategies. Coping styles differ in terms of their efficacy and effect on one's well-being following a traumatic event. Those who use healthy coping styles typically have more positive outcomes. Previously, research has shown that experiencing positive psychological changes following a traumatic event can lead to increased wisdom. Yet the ways in which survivors cope needs to be further explored. Therefore, the purpose of the study was to understand individual coping profiles in dealing with traumatic events and whether they predict wisdom. And we define wisdom according to the San Diego Wisdom Scale, which is based on common wisdom models with a neurobiological underpinning. So the study was comprised of 111 emerging adults from 18 to 29 years of age who had previously experienced a traumatic event. Participants completed an online survey on coping, wisdom, and PTSD symptoms in life events. Our goal of the study was to use latent profile analysis to determine individual coping profiles in dealing with trauma, and additionally run a multiple linear regression to determine which coping profiles predicted wisdom. So a latent profile analysis revealed 5 profiles. 26.1% of the sample were adaptive copers, which is the dark blue line in the figure here. And they scored high on active coping, positive reframing, planning, and religious coping. 14.4% were what we call non-copers, and that's in orange. And they scored low on all coping strategies. 9% used multifaceted coping, and that's in gray in the figure here. And so they scored high on the majority of coping strategies. 12.6% were maladaptive copers in yellow, and they scored high on substance use, behavioral disengagement, and self-blame. And 37.8% were what we called average copers, and that's in light blue. And they scored around the mean for all coping strategies. So next we ran a multiple linear regression that was used to predict wisdom with the adaptive coping group as our reference group. So in comparison to the adaptive copers, maladaptive coping was predictive of lower levels of wisdom. So by focusing on the stressor or one's reaction to it, rather than learning effective coping strategies, these individuals may experience vulnerability to distress following the traumatic event instead of the positive benefits such as wisdom. So it appears that trauma survivors who use adaptive coping strategies may be able to transcend adversity by finding meaning and develop a deeper understanding of their own suffering. In our study, we found that those that engaged in coping strategies that were maladaptive were less likely to develop wisdom in comparison to those who used more adaptive strategies. And these findings are supported by previous work from our lab, demonstrating that higher levels of self-transcendence, a concept very similar to wisdom, are associated with positive changes in well-being for maladaptive copers during the COVID-19 pandemic. So including coping styles and trauma assessments may inform the design of interventions for individuals at risk for PTSD. Clinicians can also incorporate wisdom teachings into mental health care to promote the use of adaptive coping. And these interventions may then result in positive mental health outcomes and help trauma survivors engage in healing, recovery, and post-traumatic growth following a traumatic event. So thank you for listening to our presentation, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Wonderful, thanks, Melanie. Our next talk is titled Intergenerational Dialogue and Wisdom Narratives. I'll pass it over to Zachary.
Hello, I hope you all can see my face, and my screen should be sharing in a second.
Yes.
Cool. All right, well, thank you all for having me today. I'm glad that you all were able to join and talk a little bit with me and answer some questions. Thank you guys for your previous presentations. I've really enjoyed listening to them so far. So my name is Zach Swanson, and I'm a master's candidate at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. I'm going to talk to you today about intergenerational dialogue and its potential to foster wisdom narratives among its members. So our research question was, what are the benefits of intergenerational dialogue? And broadly, intergenerational dialogue refers to active forms of dialogue that exist among different generations. So typically researchers conceive of this type of dialogue skipping a generation. So you can think of a grandparent and a grandchild type relationship, or often mentors, mentees, in jobs and everywhere in our lives, we see these types of relationships. So a lot of previous researchers have looked at what kind of intergenerational programs can provide positive benefits to our communities. So these previous research examples show that it has increased things such as generativity, it's promoted higher psychological well-being, as well as reduced ageist and racial prejudices. And generally, it's conceived of being important for the transfer of cultural knowledge. So I thought whenever I was investigating this, what could be the additional benefits that we've yet to explore? So in general, in the empirical literature, there is a paucity of findings, and a lot of these programs haven't been explored to their full extent. So we wanted to expand this a little bit and look at what are the potential character development mechanisms as well as the wisdom mechanisms. So we think that there are a lot of promise for intergenerational dialogue to be included in further wisdom research. So we had a small pilot study this summer that has looked at the effects and benefits of intergenerational dialogue. So we had 44 participants, 22 older adults and 22 younger adults, and we had them engage in 2 intergenerational semi-structured interviews. So for us, the big focus that would really prompt some of these more deep moving mechanisms were the questions that they were being asked. So what are these people talking about, and how is that going to affect what kind of outcomes that we can see? So we decided to focus in on like the big questions in life, things such as like meaning, life, death, morality, all of these really fun things that we've talked about within wisdom research especially, as well as significant relationships, significant life events, and resilience as well. So we had several quantitative scales that we looked at, looking at things such as pro-social behavior, generativity, as well as well-being and ageism. But the focus of what I'm going to talk to you about right now is each participant had to engage in some reflection prompts. And one of the questions that we asked just openly was, what are the benefits of intergenerational dialogue? And to code these answers, we used thematic analysis. And to our surprise, we really did not expect a lot of people to talk about wisdom just in an open sense. But in particular, the younger adults, we had a significant amount, almost 40% of younger adults said that wisdom was a direct outcome that they saw this type of dialogue having. So in general, relationship building was another major theme that we saw. As you can imagine, these intergenerational dialogue conversations really are good at building relationships. But when you get to the deeper core of what it means to be a person, you're really able to see that wisdom can be something that can be transmitted from older and younger adults. So I have right here a quote from one of our participants that was pretty directly stating what we found, which is one of the main benefits from intergenerational communication is the wisdom that one can receive from talking to someone older. And this is a theme that's seen across many people, many places, all the times. So I really think that this is a promising area for future research in wisdom. So as my advisor, Dr. Ralph Hood said, in order to study wisdom, we need to study wise people. So I really think that that is at the core of this project, and I'm looking forward to talking with all of you more. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Zachary. Okay, that brings us to our final talk. The title of our final talk is Better the Two Devils You Know Than the One You Don't. Predictability Influences Judgments of Moral Character.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Alex Walker, and today I'm going to be presenting the results of a study investigating how perceptions of a person's predictability influence judgments of their moral character. Now, evaluating the character of others is important for our social well-being. That is, it is important for us to be able to distinguish between trustworthy potential cooperators and those most likely to be unreliable or cause us harm. With the current study, we sought to further our understanding of how people evaluate the character of others, specifically the moral character of others, by assessing whether people possess a moral preference for more predictable, immoral actors. Specifically, we tested the hypothesis that people described as performing an immoral action without an intelligible motive, such as Mr. A, would be judged as less predictable and less moral than those performing the same immoral action along with an additional immoral action for a more well-understood reason, such as Mr. B. And notably, this work is relevant to questions surrounding people's management of uncertainty, a feature often attributed to wisdom, as it asks whether people may manage uncertainty in their social worlds by discounting the moral character and trustworthiness of those who they perceive as unpredictable. Okay. So to assess our research question, we recruited 524 US and Canadian residents from Prolific and had participants judge the character of 2 different immoral actors in a random order within a within subject's design. These immoral actors mirrored those depicted as Mr. A and Mr. B on the previous slide. That is, participants were described a no reason actor who was said to have punched a stranger for no reason. That is, this person was described as not benefiting in any way from punching the stranger who was unknown to him. Participants also were described an immoral reason actor who was said to have punched a stranger in order to escape punishment for a previous immoral action of theirs, in this particular case, a bank robbery. Now, following each vignette, participants judged each actor on various dimensions. Most notably, participants judged the predictability of each actor using a 100-point slider, in which 0 was said to represent the most unpredictable person they could imagine, and 100 the most predictable person they could imagine. As well as participants judged the moral character of each actor using a 100-point slider, in which 0 represented the most immoral or bad person they could imagine, and 100 the most moral or good person they could imagine. Now, looking at the results of the study, we see, probably not surprisingly, that participants judged the presented immoral reason actors, here shown in blue, that is, those actors described as assaulting a stranger in order to escape punishment, as more predictable than no reason actors described as assaulting a stranger for seemingly no reason. Most notably, these more predictable immoral reason actors were judged as more moral than our less predictable no reason actors, despite being described as performing an additional immoral act. That is, these are immoral reason actors were described as not only assaulting a stranger, but also as performing some sort of act of theft, for example, a bank robbery, whereas our no reason actors were only described as assaulting a stranger, albeit in a manner that appeared unpredictable. Now, in conclusion, we take this as evidence of a moral preference for more predictable immoral actors, with this preference in the case of our study resulting in our participants perceiving as more moral a person who performed an additional immoral action that resulted in additional harm. And notably, we've been able to replicate this pattern of results across multiple well-powered studies using different materials and study designs. And on this basis, have proposed that perceptions of predictability may play an important, yet perhaps currently overlooked, role in how we evaluate the moral character of others, at least within the domain of immoral actors performing immoral actions, such as those featured in this study.
All right, thanks very much, Alex.
Thanks. There we go.
Okay, great. So I'll invite all of the speakers to turn their videos on, and others as well, if you'd like. We do have a few minutes remaining for questions. I first want to thank the presenters for an exceptional set of talks that was fascinating from start to finish. I really enjoyed that, and they were so well executed. You know, grade of A across the board. So thank you very much for putting that effort into this. A virtual round of applause from everyone in the audience. So we do have a couple questions that have come up. There was some energy around Jin Sung's talk. One of the questions I saw come up was whether studying sagehood would differ than studying something like wisdom. And then I saw you were able to respond a bit to that in terms of exemplars, because it was suggested that maybe exemplars might be a route. There was another question, however, from an audience member. If someone consistently scores very high in a state measure of wisdom, such as Grossman Swiss, across situations, is this person a sage? Or does sagacity capture something beyond a stable tendency to think or behave wisely? So Jin Sung, I want to give you the chance to respond to the issue of measurement.
All right, so I think you saw some of the discussion happening in there, where this is where I think my background as a philosopher starts showing its head a little bit. where I think this is where we kind of start going into anthropology and maybe not strictly measurement-based psychology. Because, and there's somebody else in the audience who I think can actually speak better to this. My lab mate, Stephanie Morris, has some examples where certain measures of wisdom break down when you apply them to somebody who, if you have a long form interview with them, may seem very wise, very sagacious, and you actually walk them through the wisdom measure, and they'll start picking it apart and saying, am I humble? I don't think I'm humble. I mean, you know, I still have all of these issues. So this is kind of where my personal biases would say, I do think you need kind of more natural history approaches to studying sagehood at a certain point, just because I think there's going to be a certain richness to it that if you have a fixed stable measure, I don't think it's going to work. Now, that said, somebody who scores highly for, you know, experience sample them for an entire year and they're like, oh yeah, I'm having a horrible time of it. Okay, what are you doing to solve it? Oh, all the right things. They managed to score high on the Swiss for an entire year. Put that person in an interview and give me a tape recorder. Like, I want to talk to this person. Who are they and what are they doing? But I don't think that would automatically qualify somebody for sagehood. I think that's just kind of this is kind of the screening mechanism that we should probably use in order to find out who it is we should be studying.
Thank you, Jinsung. And I think there was a follow-up question in the chat if you'd like to respond to that. I saw another question pop up for Alex, the most recent talk. So Alex, the question is, do you have predictions about what would happen for moral acts? So giving to charity with a moral reason versus no reason, who would people prefer? Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, so I was actually just typing out my response to that, but yeah, I could just say my response. So yeah, that's a question that's consistently come up with presenting this work, and I think it's because it's you know, a obvious next step and an interesting question. I don't have a strong prediction. It could be in one case that people just have a general aversion to unpredictable people. One of the results we see is that people find unpredictable people to be really bad cooperation partners. They tell us that explicitly. So it could be a general aversion, in which case, even if people are doing moral acts, unpredictable people are preferred less. It could be the fact, however, that this moral preference for more predictable actors is kind of restrained to the immoral domain, as these are the people who we might have to most keep our eye on in terms of our, you know, personal well-being, in terms of, you know, cooperating with. And so I hope to test that in future work, but as of right now, I don't have a strong prediction for that question.
Okay, thank you for that elaboration, Alex. The last thing I want to focus on is the work by Trish and Zachary, because there was a theme that emerged in terms of intergenerational work. Really fascinating stuff. So one question I have is, you know, in Zachary, in your work, people had the sense that wisdom was being transmitted in these exchanges. I did wonder how much that might be a consequence of, say, like benevolent sageism, or an attitude toward older adults as being the holders and transmitters of wisdom. So to what extent did your participants actually express the lessons that they had learned in those encounters? And if they did do that, you know, were there any memorable lessons that the younger folks had retained? And the question is the same for you too, Trish. What's one really memorable lesson that had been taught in those interviews?
I'll start. So it was really interesting seeing what they had to say. We haven't dove quite as much into the transcripts yet, but we have each transcripts for the 2 interviews that they've done. And because we focused on a lot of these deeper questions, such as like the meaning in life, some of the big questions about like morality, where to orient your life, what significant life events and relationships you should pursue, as well as resilience. It seemed that through the reflection exercises that the students were saying, a lot of it had to do with not making the same mistakes that their grandparents or their great uncles, a lot of them chose their family members, but not making the same mistakes that others have made, and learning from other people's lessons about life was a central theme that we saw. But it was to our surprise that a lot of them explicitly stated that as a wisdom transference. And that's why when I saw this conference, I thought that was a beautiful segue and opportunity for future research to pursue.
No, really glad you're here. Trish, did you have anything that popped to mind when I asked that?
Yeah, so we took the data from a study that was done a couple of years ago. And like I said, there was no questions asked. It was just, tell me about yourself. And over 3 hours, each participant just talked about themselves. But naturally, what came out were these life lessons. For example, one woman talked about having to move from her whole family in her hometown when she was younger because her husband was transferred, and it was just a really traumatic experience. But she told the students, but you know, I met so many people along the way that changed my life, and I really want to iterate to you that how important it is to take chances and to move places and to meet new people. It will really change your life. And we documented 64 of these 5 individuals, but one after another of the older adults talking to the younger people like this, taking something from their lives and then applying it in a general way to how they could benefit from it. So it's really fascinating to just see it all unfold like that. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thanks, Trish. Okay, and with that, we are out of time. My mind is bursting with questions. I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for the stimulating talks. I'm going to pass it over back to Igor to transition us to the next segment of the program.
Thank you so much, Nick. This was a beautiful set of very stimulating discussions. I love our conversations on chat. We'll have some of them saved. I still don't know in what format. We'll try to share them with you guys later. I have that track record, and keep on going. In the meantime, let's transition to the main event. The second main event. This was the main event, but the second main event of the second part of our summit, and this is the discussion on wisdom and cultural diversity beyond cultural stereotypes and culture blindness. We want to have a panel discussion now on points of role of culture and how to avoid cultural stereotypes when discussing universal and culture-specific aspects of wisdom. Now, let me remind you how we did it. One little thing is I would like to encourage you once again to mute yourself in case you're unmuted, because some people appear to be unmuted right now. First of all, thank you. First of all, we had keynote presenters that graciously agreed to record their presentations and share with us asynchronously so that you guys can watch them in different parts of the world at your leisure time. And next, so those presentations are online. Check them out on our website, wisdomsummit.uwaterloo.ca. Next, today, we will have several panelists, particularly Melody Chao from Hong Kong and Michel Ferrari from Toronto, who will take position to these presentations. And we also have at least one of the keynoters in the audience with us who will also be able to correspond and reflect on some of the ideas at the intersection of the very complex questions concerning wisdom and morality and culture and anthropological questions that we may have. Particularly Clark Barrett is with us today. Unfortunately, Michael Bond and I don't know what that is, but that was exciting. Somebody was testing their microphone. Wonderful. Okay, so as I was saying, we have a panel at which Clark, Melody, and Michel will be able to exchange the dialogue. First, Melody and Michel prepared some remarks on the talks. Unfortunately, 2 of the other keynote presenters cannot join us because of professional obligations live in Nanjing and in Hong Kong. And they send their regrets. We will have, as in the previous session, first the structured panel discussion, followed by breakout discussions. And in these breakout discussions, where you will be working in small groups, we will use, once again, the Padlet and I will post the link again for the Padlet in the chat. We'll use this Padlet to collect the thoughts about your ideas on the role of culture for wisdom. And then we'll come back into the general discussion and try to address some of the key questions moderated by Melody and Michel. And so I will first pass now to, I think, Melody, and then we'll pass it on to Michel. And then we'll give Clark an opportunity to respond if he wants to. And without any further ado, here is our first presenter for the panel discussion on wisdom and culture.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks, Igor, for organizing this wonderful summit. And so, today here, we're going to briefly talk about the role between wisdom and culture. And we have three wonderful keynote speakers talking on this topic. And so what I'll do in the next few minutes is just to kind of reflect on the content of what they talk about. And in fact, when I was watching the video, when I was listening to the talk, it actually brings up more questions than answers. So I think for the next few minutes, it's more for me to kind of share some of the questions that I have. And I wonder if our audience would have any thoughts and idea to share and exchange. And so I think across all three talks, there's the central core focus about the puzzles of culture. And so the question is, what is wisdom if we take on a cultural perspective? And so from each of the talk, there is like a key points that I got out of the talk. And I'm going to elaborate each of them and also follow with my puzzles about each of the points. And so the first cultural puzzle in Michael Bond's talk. So the question is, what is wisdom? And from the talk, it feels like the idea is that being wise is being effective is in a given cultural system. And so the question that kind of made me wonder is, if it is about being effective in a given culture, then does it boils down to being able to fit into a culture? Then in that case, it means that being wise is being able to fit in. And it kind of connect to the literature about non-adherence. And so in the talk, he talked about an example of empathy and compassion. And so talk about how empathy and compassion is not the default in culture that prioritize self-directness and practicality. So the question that I have is that, so given that we have some discussion yesterday about empathy and compassion seems to be part of wisdom. So the puzzle that I have here is whether is it wise to have this attribute, and also to think of it in a more abstract level. Is it wise to be a cultural misfit in this case, given that empathy and compassion is not something valued? So on the one hand, we can see that maybe cultural misfit is not something wise because given the argument that it's not impactful. If you have sympathy and compassion, and if it match up with the wrong culture, then it's not part of being wise because it's not useful. So that's one possibility. But on the other hand, if we also look back in the literature of how wisdom is defined, it's something very rare and uncommon. And so in a sense, can it be wise if someone actually is kind of a cultural misfit where the person is actually counter the dominant cultural norm? And so if it is rare and if it's uncommon, then you might actually bring into new perspective to the common group. So that's the question that I have. And so this also brings up to the point about the connection between wisdom and culture as non-adherence. So are we talking about the outcome where we classify a person as fit or misfit in a culture? And or are we focusing on the idea of the process involved? Because from this argument, we can potentially see that if we just focus on the observable actions, the outcome, there is like a fit or misfit versus misfit perception, wise versus non-wise. But then if we actually focus on observable deliberation, maybe it's the process that's more important. So if we define wisdom in terms of the process, maybe it's not about the final outcome of fit versus misfit. That's about wisdom, but it's more about the process of being aware of potential fit and misfit. And given the process of deliberation, you might still choose to do one way or another. So my question here is more about it. Where does wisdom lie in? Is it about the observable final outcome, or is it about the process? And this kind of is also in line with one of the keynote talk from yesterday, where it talks about looking at wisdom in terms of the power of reflection, the time that people spend before they take an action. So my puzzle here is, where does wisdom lie? Is it the actions or the process of deliberation, where we understand wisdom and culture? And kind of along the same line, in another presentation by Wang, the question is about, in this case, they found that people who have interdependent style tend to act in a quote more wise manner in terms of making decision for both the self and the others. They don't differentiate, and compare with independent self who only will make wiser decision for the other person. So the question that I have here is that, is it still considered as wise if it is a cultural default? So for example, for interdependent culture, or culture that value interdependent self, the wise attribute is kind of like a cultural default. So is it something wise to do, or is it only wise if it is in common? So it kind of boils back to the other question from the other presentation about how do we understand wisdom? And on a related note, another point is that when it comes to talking about connecting wisdom and culture, and going back to what we just mentioned about non-adherence, what we see here is about, again, the differentiation between the outcome versus the process. So if it is the outcome, if outcome is the definition of wisdom, then in that case, it's about the articulated decisions the person make for their friend, for example, in this case. But then if we look into culture in terms of the process, it's something unobservable, but it's the unobservable deliberation processes that people have about being aware of potential options, not just one option, but options for your friend that might, that they could have chosen. But they might, at the end of the day, they might articulate one decision over another. So my question here again is about, where does wisdom lie when we talk about culture and wisdom? And similarly, in the talk by Barrett, also have this similar in kind of reactions about the understanding of knowledge, because we think from the results of the study that he mentioned is about is wisdom about a duty to know about different reactions that people have to wrongdoing, and how people have different expectations about what people should know. And with this, it seems to point to the idea that maybe culture and wisdom is somehow connected in terms of declarative knowledge. And similarly, it was kind of interesting to look at the wisdom survey result that Igor put together, because what I noticed is that if you look at the graph on the right side, declarative knowledge was actually seen as something non-universal. I was actually surprised when I see this result, because for declarative knowledge, it really depends on what aspect of declarative knowledge that we talk about when we classify it as non-universal. And my guess is that when people talk about culture and declarative knowledge in this context, they tend to focus on maybe the content of the declarative knowledge, where it's about how specific things were done. But I was actually thinking that declarative knowledge can actually be more about the process. So what I see is that even for the same thing, declarative knowledge, the content can be culture specific, but the process of deriving and the functions of declarative knowledge can actually be quite universal across culture. So in this case, again, I have this kind of observable versus unobservable puzzles about, so where does wisdom lie? Is it about the observable content specific that we see, or is it about the process, the unobservable ones? And with this, putting all the three talks together, this is a general observation, is that if we recall from, if you were in the talk yesterday, if we just talk about wisdom without the cultural component. The conversation tend to focus on the process, about the cognitive processes involved. It was about the emotion, the motivation involved when we just talk about wisdom. But interestingly, when we start to bring into a cultural element, we try to understand wisdom, it seems that the discourses shift from more a process approach to a more outcome focus. And the focus tend to be about the more observable. Usually it's about observable differences across culture. And so my question here is that how much weight should we put in the two components about the observable versus the process? I can kind of see that the two can coexist. So the question here is more about how much of it is wisdom, where does it lie, and how can we better understand culture and wisdom if we put the two together? And also my guess is that if we actually focus on the process, maybe we find more commonality than differences across culture. But if we focus on the observable outcome, we might find more differences. So this is the end of my sharing. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you so much, Melody. What a provocative set of comments. We will pass on to Michel, and Michel will be able to provide his perspective on this intricate interrelationship between culture and wisdom.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Melody. And I think what I'm going to talk about is actually matches perfectly with what you're saying. So let me share my screen for a second. So once again, let me echo and say thanks to Igor, to Nick, to everybody involved in setting up this conference. I found it fascinating so far. And as always, expanding my horizons as to what this entire field can be about. So it's very exciting to be part of this conference, and also even an honor to be invited to comment on these great talks that we have had the privilege to listen to. Now, what I'm going to do is do something very similar to what Melody's is doing, but I'm going to suggest a narrative orientation for our cross-cultural discussions. And I'm basing this because unpublished manuscript by Paul Baltes, I think, is very well known to people in this area. His book on orchestrating mind and virtue. He mentions that if you ask people about wisdom, people often respond in a few basic ways. They'll talk about some exemplary people they know. They'll talk about proverbs and insights. They'll talk about solutions to fundamental life problems. But so that they seem quite distinct, but if you try to coordinate these, you can coordinate them through a basic narrative structure. You've got characters who are wise people, wise characters, who have resources, insights, and they use them to solve problems that motivate the story. So bear with me as you'll see how I find that this type of frame helps us tie our talks together. So as we see, we've got wise characters, their actions define a plot event, a wise decision or action, and that action or reaction to an event define their character. And so it shows them to be wise. And of course, we've got basic things like orientation, a problem that they're dealing with, rising action, some resolution, and so a climax to it, and then resolution, basic narrative structure. Of course, this can all be complexified, but let's just start with something simple. So wise characters. I think one of them, say, our three keynote presentations can be coordinated when you consider them this way. According to Michael Harris Bond, effective characters or people will be considered wise. So they'll be wise if they're effective. And who's considered wise? It depends on the kind of problems that are most valued by a particular cultural community. And I think Melody makes an excellent point, which is to say that, so this is from the Bonded one, 2014, from the talk. He makes this point that, cultural historical circumstances will lead different groups to prioritize certain person profiles and to socialize people accordingly. And so it becomes basically actors who do right in the right way in their cultural system are regarded as wise. And Melody is right, I think, to say that, well, what about people who do unexpected things? To say they go against what the culture would have expected, and yet in that way might still be admired. So in other words, people who usually, cultures that usually value practicality over civility, but someone who's exceptionally civil, especially if they don't lose the practicality, if they're able to do both, I imagine they could be considered wise. Or say it's practically a trope in wisdom research that people who are able to coordinate self and others, say for a common good that also doesn't undermine their own well-being, will be considered wise. Now this is actually from Jindong Wei and Fengyan Wang's other published work coming out in 2021. They sent me a copy of it. But they mentioned the Confucian self as a sort of larger and smaller self. But in this sort of larger sort of conceptualization, they point out that you can actually have a Buddha self, clean and dusty, say the proverbial mirror, and the Taoist hard and soft self. These are all different ways of understanding the self. And so their notion that the way we understand the self is itself a cultural construct. And even within a culture, there can be different traditions that understand the self in particular ways. That all of this will have consequences for the way that people are considered wise, and also for the kinds of stories that they seek to embody, or for that matter, also respond to how they'll respond to problems that arise for them. Considering with Paul Ricoeur that identity is very much bound up with narrative. Now, I find, say, Clark Barrett's work is an elegant example of the other side of this, the plot side, which is to say that I was struck by how elegantly he was able to manipulate critical narrative elements that orient characters' actions to solving problems, for example, like stopping a fight, or sometimes that create problems, poison a community well, and to show that these affect people's appraisal of the characters in the story and their wisdom, presumably, differently in different cultures. So from Michael Bond, we suggest that different weightings of core values can explain this. But from Wei and Wang, we can draw the idea that different forms of self-understanding can alter problem appraisals themselves. So they make the point that the Solomon's paradox doesn't work well with the Chinese understanding of self, in which, say, in the larger sense of self, your relationships to others are part of your broader self, and that negates Solomon's paradox. I was it's too bad that Professor Wang isn't here, because I was very curious to ask him whether other ways of achieving self-distancing might work better than, for example, imagining your future self 20 years from now versus yourself now, or something of that kind. Say whether that would still achieve the effect that self-other differentiation achieves for the Solomon's paradox, because it seems as though there was no effect on wise reasoning. Well, the idea then is that varying cultural understandings of wisdom and its development may exist. And of course, this is again from Professor Wang and students' paper, this idea that there are paths to development of self that are mapped out within these traditions, that we could, the saint here is really Shengren, so I'm not sure why they put saint, but this idea that there is a set progression. I'm going to agree with Melody that, are these just superficial differences, or are there actual, this would require careful study, are there actual sort of phenomenological differences that are associated with these different types of people in these different stages of progression? And where does all that leave the cross-cultural study of wisdom? I think that it shows we can study exemplars, characters, who's wise, why, how we identify and relate to such people, cultural differences among ideal types of wise characters. We can also systematically vary aspects of the narratives about fundamental life experiences that people or characters engage in, and how they construe their actions, say, and see how that affects our judgments of wisdom. But I think that although this can show cross-cultural differences, both Clark Barrett and Michael Harris Bond noted that we also need to have a rationale for our cultural samples. Like, why those cultures or those subcultures? What trait, for example, or what quality are we expecting should be characteristic of wisdom and that should differ across cultures? And then we should measure everyone in the sample, say, on this variable. For example, if large and small self matter, we should measure those aspects in all the people and see what effect they have. Then we could get profiles for ideal types of effective or wise people, ideal solutions to like problems, the resources needed to develop those types of abilities. So we could ask, for example, with Clark Barrett's participants, I mean, he didn't do it, but a question like this could be asked of such people solving these dilemmas. Well, what's the best thing to do now that the harm is done? Or what would a wise person do? Or more directly, what would someone who followed the common model of a wisdom model, for example, using perspectival metacognition, or what Kurt Gray in the early morning session called balanced pragmatism, what would they do to address this moral problem? Would they be doing the right thing if they acted that way? So I think by sort of getting people's spontaneous reactions, but then prompting them or asking them about certain things that have been proposed as wise, or even simply asking them what would it mean to be wise, might be a really interesting way of getting at cross-cultural assessment of various ideas of wisdom. And it avoids arriving and testing Western theories as though they're the last word on what it means to be a wise person and who acts wisely. So I'll just end there. I hope I haven't gone over time. I wasn't checking it, but I thought I left myself lots of time. So, but I'm really actually much more interested in the general discussion that we all have together.
Thank you so much, Michel. Now, I think we have actually Clark in the audience, and I don't know if he has an opportunity right now to comment and would like to respond to any of the reflections, because Clark is an anthropologist and can potentially speak to this with a greater level of detail. But let's see if he's able to be on the in our discussion.
Hi. I wasn't sure if I was able to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for, it's nice to meet you, Melody and Michel. Good to see you, Igor. Thanks for inviting me. Those are great comments. I don't actually have anything directly to say other than I think that those are some great ideas. I mean, I guess I had a couple just brief reflections that maybe could spur some further conversation. The points that Melody was making about observable versus unobservable characteristics, I mean, that to me resonates with, well, there's certain kinds of anthropological literatures about, well, things like mental opacity beliefs, so that there are places in the world where people believe that the mind is opaque, more than in other places. I think we all have some degree of belief that the minds of others are opaque. Nobody thinks you can directly perceive other people's thoughts, but I don't know if that's the kind of thing you're pointing to, Melody. You know, the places like the United States and Europe are often seen as, and I don't know that we know this for sure, but some anthropologists argue that these places focus most on a sort of transparent model of the mind, or that our cultural discourses really have to do with what's going on inside of other people's minds, and that we're happy to speculate about those things. I'm not sure if this is what you're pointing to, but that might suggest that to the extent that the literature on wisdom is somewhat skewed towards samples from those kinds of cultural backgrounds, maybe that has led to a, you know, some sort of skew in the literature on wisdom, where wisdom is really seen as about internal, you know, we think about the process, in other words, is the way that you were putting it. Whereas in other places, my intuition would be that there will be places where people say, well, I don't know what someone is thinking. I can't diagnose whether someone is wise or not by access to their thoughts. I can only diagnose their wisdom through access to their deeds. And I mean, I think that's a subtle distinction, right? Because it has to do with observability, but it could be that those people, I mean, my hunch would be that those people would say, there are internal processes that make the person wise. You simply are unable to observe them. And so that we can only know wisdom. We can only know wisdom through action. We can only identify who's wise through action. That's pure speculation, but that resonated with what you were suggesting to me, Melody. I don't know if you want me to make multiple comments and then Igor, or shall I just see if there are thoughts on that?
We can do a little bit of back and forth if Melody wants to sort of reflect, or if there are additional people from the audience who have comments. Folks from the audience, please put them in the chat and I can read them out. But maybe I'll pass back to Melody and Michel first. Michel also had some questions that you probably want to comment on. You specifically commented on your studies.
Yeah.
But first, let's go back to Melody. Just give me 1 second. I need to find the proper button to unmute Melody because here you go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Igor. So thanks, Clark, for the comment. I think this is actually a very interesting point. It kind of reminds me about some research on creativity in the sense that, it's also similar to the study of wisdom. So in the study of creativity, there's that debate about what is creative? Is being creative something internal to the person, about what I do as being creative? But then at the same time, it's also important for the other people to recognize that something is creative. So I think what you point to is that similarly in the study of wisdom, it's not necessarily just about the person procession of the quality, but also, maybe recognition from other about what they see. And I guess that in the current way of studying wisdom, in what we talk about, there is that tendency to still towards more about what people see and how people perceive it. But then I also have the question about whether we can actually truly see what is like a true wisdom inside a person. So that's kind of the reaction that I have. It's actually very similar to other domain of study like creativity or intelligence, or maybe like performance appraisal. In the context, it's more in the management area. So like in the context of performance appraisal, we can only appraise a person based on how the person act and behave. But then we cannot infer what quality the person has. So it's possible that two persons might have the same competency, but then one person might display more than the others. So what we can only do is to look at what we observe, and I kind of feel like maybe we cannot really truly look into the core of what is in the person. So I kind of agree with you that maybe like that's the limitation that we have. But I guess it's also important to bring this into a more conscious discussion, because we kind of tend to have the assumption that what we see is what is in the person. There's that tendency to ignore the possibility that people might not be displaying and showing what they actually have, and there could be a discrepancy in that manner. So thanks for the comments.
Okay. Can I follow up on that briefly? So this is just sort of prompted by what you were saying. A couple additional thoughts were, as an anthropologist. So the study that I presented in my talk, there's a cross-cultural study that uses vignette methods that you were talking about, and in those cases it's interesting because all I have access to is you send out these questionnaires, you send to these other places that I've never been before, and then I trust my collaborators to administer them properly, and then we get the data back. And then, in some sense, those data are what anthropologists would call thin, because, they're for me, they're decontextualized. So I often have trouble interpreting some of the differences that we see. But as a person, my hunches about things like wisdom come both from my own cultural background, and then the last couple of decades that I've spent doing work in indigenous communities in Ecuador, particularly in Shuar communities. And, I wonder if, with respect to this internal, external type of dimension, if we had more communities like this, so both indigenous communities, but also specifically, there's some unique features of Shuar communities, which make me think about wisdom that may be underrepresented in the cross-cultural literature on this. And one is that Shuar views of knowledge and wisdom and things like power and power in the good sense, well, in both the good and bad sense, I shouldn't even put it that way, but personal efficacy are really tied up in secrecy. So the most, the people who are viewed as having the most wisdom, the most knowledge, they're completely impenetrable and they're viewed culturally as completely impenetrable in terms of their knowledge, precisely because things like shamanic training is done entirely in secret and the knowledge is transferred both in secret and through means, spiritual means that ordinary people don't have access to. So there was no way that any of us could know these things unless we had also gone through shamanic training ourselves. So, and yet everyone recognizes who the efficacious, there's a specific word in Shuar that indicates this capacity, this sort of personal efficacy and knowledge combined. And it's best translated as power, personal power, but it has to do with secrecy. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think that, maybe that's a little bit different than some of these traditions that we've seen, where wisdom, perhaps it resembles something like this sort of hermit model of wisdom that I saw talked about a little bit, but maybe not directly, because these people are central in the communities. They're not peripheral. It's just that that the most important knowledge is secret, I guess is the way I would put it. And then the other thing I just wanted to say before passing the mic along is, I also thought this was prompted a little bit in the discussion of the model of that you see in some Native American cultures of the trickster as a wise figure, right? And here, this is disruption as wisdom. And it's related to what you were saying as, I think that this is also true in some East Asian cultures as well, that you have this sort of archetype of someone who creates, who creates knowledge in others specifically by doing things that are, it could be seen as antagonistic or disruptive to their normal ways of thinking. I think that's interesting to think about, because it relates, Melody, to what you were asking at the beginning about whether wisdom is sort of cultural normativity or whether wisdom is about being a cultural outlier. And the trickster kind of sits in the middle there, right? Because it's not that the trickster is necessarily a cultural outlier per se, it's just that they adopt a particular role as a wise individual. Of course, they have embodied all the cultural knowledge of their culture. It's just that they do these actions in the world that come from a place of wisdom, but also create wisdom in others. And that could be an interesting thing to add to the mix of, I would be surprised if that kind of, even though that kind of archetype is specific to certain cultures, I would be surprised if it wasn't easily recognizable to people in other cultures. I think that those kinds of characters appear in certain kinds of films in the United States and Europe, for example, and it's very easy for us to see those people as wise and to understand how the interventions they're doing come from a place of wisdom. So that could be an interesting thing to consider in these models. I had what if I don't know if others like to speak. I haven't spoken. I haven't said anything about Michel's comments, which I also very much appreciated. But I'll just say very briefly, one thing that I really appreciated was your suggestion, Michel, about the idea that we use that plot as part of what's evoking some of these differences in moral judgment in the vignette style studies. And then you suggested asking some additional questions that we didn't ask, which I think would be great. So what would a wise person do in this situation? I think a value of that would be one thing that I worry about with some studies that I've seen about wisdom, as great as they are, in order to get greater generality or something like that in our conclusions about wisdom, often we ask about just extremely abstract questions that are decontextualized, right? And so I really appreciate your suggestion. It could be very great. It would be a great idea to use these specific contexts like poisoning a well or these unwise choices kind of contexts as the prompt for wisdom, because, you know, one of the things that that study suggested is that it's probably highly contextual, that, you know, the wise thing to do in this situation is different than the wise thing to do in that situation. And by using these narrative plots as a prompt to evoke people's opinions could be a great sort of combination of both meeting between open-ended questions, but also experimental manipulations, because you've provided the context and then you ask what the person would do and have it be an open-ended question that could then be coded in some way. So I appreciate that suggestion.
Can I just say one thing about that, and then we'll open it up more broadly? But yeah, I got that idea actually from listening to your talk, because part of it, what you said was, I'm not 100% sure why, for example, in Africa, they don't say credit anybody, even though it's unintentional. And maybe they actually thought a reasonable person should know this. And so that seemed like a way in which you could open up that space and give people the opportunity to say something about these different, you know, intentional versus unintentional, that for them doesn't hold any weight in this particular, you know, context or something.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. I mean, that's an example of something where the study sort of prompted, and some of the things that people said post interview, but it wasn't really part of the official data collection. Made me think about these, and I think that in psychology, I mean, this may not be right, but I think sometimes in psychology there's a tendency to want to, in order to have standardized answers and things like that, we do forced choice responses and scales, and then we're inherently going to miss those kinds of things. I know in the project that I'm working on, we tend to avoid the open-ended questions because the data are so difficult to deal with compared to, you know, you just ask a scale, how wise was this choice on a scale of 1 to 5? And that's easy to do statistically, but you're right. I mean, I think it means that we don't have insight into why people were giving their responses.
We had some questions from the chat, and for those of us who are following it on YouTube or will watch this later, I just want to highlight maybe one or two that I found particularly interesting and see if one of you would like to respond. For instance, one question that Emma Buchtel posted about unwise decisions. She said, if mental processes are not applicable, obscured, could it be that unwise decisions are easy to identify? For instance, stupid ones, showing you don't have a firm grasp of things you ought to know, like don't you ever pour weird things into the well? But wise decisions less easy to identify, unless it's something like showing long-term perspective, saving grain in a place safe from flooding. So, any comments on this? Are wise decisions harder to identify than unwise decisions?
Well, I could jump in with the beginning of the response. I think that, I mean, that's why I like the overall narrative frame idea, because I do think that even the notion that certain things are, you read between the lines of what the story signifies, possibly, let's say, in what an action might signify. But in the end, we need to go by what people do. And I do think that it's true, things that you would expect a reasonable person to know, and they don't do it, show foolishness. And often things that you would expect to be the outcome, and someone does something very surprising. Let's say, could be an example of wisdom. So I can give an example from Gandhi's autobiography that really struck me, is that his wife is on her sort of, you know, she's like hair away from death, and the doctor calls and says, the only thing that will save her is to give her beef broth, and they're Hindus. And so he says, don't give it to her. You know, we're Hindus, and he said, this is the only thing that's going to keep her alive. It's like, no, don't give it to her. And then he says, the doctor says, well, I'm sorry, I really thought it's the only thing. I gave it to her already. And he's like, okay, you're no longer my doctor. We're coming to get my wife right now. And he's like, you can't move her. She's like, you know, she's going to die at any second. So they come get her. They take her all the way back to their sort of ashram community, and she recovers. And then in the end, she says, "You were right. That was the right thing to do." And what's striking to me about that is at several points along the story, I would absolutely not have acted that way. I would have thought, like, I'm going to defer to the doctor, and yet I thought it's quite striking. It's just one example of the kind of way he operated that sort of really went against what you would have expected and says volumes about him. So I think that stories can actually sort of show wise wisdom in that way, by the sort of choices people make, or the things that they do.
So yeah, maybe also to echo to what Michel mentioned is kind of made me wonder along what Emma mentioned is that maybe what is wise is hard to judge. We can only judge it here and now, what we see as something wise or unwise. But then maybe it's possible that something that might be seen as unwise at a given moment, if you actually stretch it in a more long-term perspective, it might turn out to be something wise. So I guess that's also where the ambiguity is. And then so the question is like, where do you do the cutoff? Because let's say if the time spent is like this long and then we're just looking at this part, then we wouldn't be able to get the answer. So I guess kind of that, I don't think we can actually empirically resolve that unless we study the whole lifespan of the whole human generations. But then I think maybe that's also a potential assumptions or limitation that we need to keep in mind about the limitation we have when we are studying what is seen as wise or unwise. Is probably time bounded. There could be variation, and then maybe what was seen as unwise can potentially turn out to be something wise. So we don't really have the answer unless we actually live through it. So I think that's the kind of reaction that I have.
Thank you so much. I have a question. We talk about sages. We talk about whether we can recognize wisdom in other people if they speak up or if they are hermits, and we talk about wisdom. What if the sages produce something that is very hard to decipher? To what extent should we be attributing wisdom to those statements, and under what circumstances? Reactions? Sages often talk in riddles, so that's what I'm after. So, like, is that a form of wisdom, or is that something to be dismissing? Oh, Michel, I think you're muted. Let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying that. Just if I go back to that Gandhi example, I'm very ambivalent about that story. It's like I'm not sure whether that was really wise or not. I mean, it does say something about him that seems to have been very effective in his life, but at the same time, it leaves me a bit uneasy, actually, this whole sort of way of operating. And there's certain people like his elder son where that really backfired. So he had a very troubled relationship with him. So I think that I think you're right. It's a great question. And in some ways, it's maybe the question for cultural studies of wisdom, because you need to interpret people, their actions, their decisions within some sort of frame, and the frame we take can really influence whether we think of them as wise or not.
Melody?
Yeah, so I guess maybe I actually kind of make me feel like, I don't know if that is too extreme to say that, but I kind of actually feel like we cannot really study true wisdom, in the sense that all we can do is to actually study people's perception of wisdom. And so kind of feel like maybe our discussion is not necessarily about what wisdom is, but it's more about how wisdom is being construed. I don't know if you would agree or not. So I also wonder what you think. Like, are we studying something called like true wisdom, or is it more just like perceptions of how people see it? And then in that case, maybe people can see it differently. So how do you think about so where is the true wisdom then? Is there something like that?
That's a great question. And actually, it was something I was wondering about. And I think Clark is back. He had some power issues, but he will try to join us in the second. There he is. We're talking about, no worries. We're talking about whether there is such a thing as a true wisdom, which is a deep question, and whether what we study are just perceptions and cultural narratives. I think that's what probably Melody to some extent refers to. And I posted in the chat earlier also the question and this kind of my interpretation of this whole line of work in the 1980s and early 90s. Michel, you know it much better than I do, on so-called implicit theories. And that is all about folk theories, folk understanding of particular concepts. There was a lot on folk theories of intelligence, folk theories of, there's still folk theories of motivation, and folk theories of wisdom. And that work then at some point became overshadowed by what Paul Baltus started doing, I think, and others, but never really truly connected, maybe only in your work to some extent, Michel. And I was wondering if you and Endel Clark, from the anthropological perspective, can comment on how do you see typically this kind of connection between the folk epistemologies on the one hand, and then behavioral processes and how people actually understand, not just like the narratives that they create, but actually engage with certain concepts, which I think a very difficult question to answer. So I apologize for raising it like that. But so first I want to ask Michel about maybe his interpretation of that movement away from, to some extent, folk and lay theories towards this so-called explicit theories. And then I'll pass on to Clark.
I think the movement away is partly because there was such a consensus that emerged from these like lay theories that we really had a sense that people had a lot of agreement about what some of the elements were, but there was also maybe a kind of deep confusion as to whether we're talking about attributes of wise people or wise people themselves. As we were saying, actually even what Melody is alluding to, whether there's sort of processes involved in making, say, sort of enacting wisely, or whether there's just examples of what wise people do. And so I think that the more precise, explicit theories allow a much more like targeted answer to particular questions. But I do think, like in the Oxford like Handbook of Wisdom that came out in 2019, Valerie Tiberius and Jason Smartwood brought this up again, that your explicit theory can't be totally divorced from, lay theories. Otherwise, say, people will think that you're talking about something else, right? I mean, similar to your jingle jangle, but if it doesn't even jingle or jangle, if it's just like, my theory of wisdom is that, it's all about sort of like plumbing, someone's going to be like, I think you're missing an understanding of what I'm talking about here. So somehow it needs to connect to it, but further articulate it. Even your example of quantum physics as being not directly observable, but of course the effects of lasers are directly observable. There are things where it has to cash out in some way into something that a lay theory will acknowledge as relevant to what we're talking about. So I think that's my sort of like my answer for how these things can relate and why we don't hear as much about them. And just one final thing is I do think that if there's any room to maneuver with this, it's cross-cultural lay theories, because that's really where there might still be much more to learn about the way people are sort of translating wisdom and understanding what wisdom means and how it's manifest in other places.
Thank you so much, Michel. Clark, any comments from a seasoned anthropologist who probably has grappled with this for quite a while, folk theories and explicit theories?
Well, and psychology has grappled with it too in many domains.
Right.
But I guess my question, I have a terminological question though, because I'm maybe not on the same page. So I usually think of lay theories as explicit theories. So maybe I'm missing the distinction, because I guess there could be, implicit, explicit. Can you verbalize it or not? Versus, is it somehow intuitive? And then I would think, our theories of Santa Claus which we can verbalize quite well, are lay theories. Am I not? So that's what I have a question about how it's being.
Yeah, so that's another example of this kind of jingle and jangle, I guess, because in psychology in the 1980s, the implicit theories of wisdom was what people believed characteristics of a wise person to be. As Michel said, like, what are the attributes of a wise person? How do we study wise people? How do we differentiate this concept of wisdom, let's say, from a concept of intelligence? What are the attributes of intelligent people? Whereas the explicit theories, like, you have defined explicitly characteristics, and you study the explicit set of characteristics among people and psychological processes, age differences, cultural difference, whatever. Michel, I hope I didn't mischaracterize this instead of...
No, I was going to say, but I have a question back to Clark, because I think even the sort of worry that you're bringing up is something that also comes up in the implicit theories literature of psychology. You know, and what if people can actually say, tell us their theory? But is there anything like this in anthropology where people's actions betray a certain understanding they have, even if they themselves can't articulate it? That's sort of what one idea about wisdom would be, is that if you just describe someone who's wise, you end up sort of revealing what you believe wisdom to be, even though if you were just given a definition, you might have said something different. So that's part of what stands behind that idea that people can't always articulate it. But I wonder if in anthropology, it seems that there must be something like that distinction. And I see we have Vivian Clayton in our audience, so surely the first person who sort of like launched this entire field, maybe she could comment if she's not put on the spot.
I think we lost Clark for a second, yeah, I will. If Vivian wants to say something on this discussion, we would love to hear from her. In the meantime, we'll wait for Clark maybe to come back on. Probably has another power outage, which is one nightmare I had today. Vivian, do you want to say something? Hello.
Unmute. Okay, thank you so much for recognizing me.
Of course.
Yes, it's very kind. This discussion has been going on for about 40 years. And I began it really out of a desire to differentiate the concept of wisdom from intelligence. And the focus indeed was on identifying the attributes of wise people. And I think in the progression and development of this field, it still hasn't been clarified as to if the attributes necessarily translate into wise behavior. And I would say now, as a mature, elderly person, slightly elderly, I'm much more interested in the actions that are identified as wise, because of the changes in our society and in the world. So that's really what I'd like to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And we had some discussion, by the way, about this in the chat a little bit earlier, where some people were discussing to what extent certain actions should have the merit of being called wise or not, just by the virtue of being activism related activities, and under what circumstances they may or may not be wise. Okay, so it seems like we are approaching right now a critical moment at which point we will be breaking into smaller groups, and there we can interact and talk to our friends and colleagues on these questions of wisdom and culture, or anything else you desire. And after that, we'll come back, and I had some questions. Can we also speak with video? Oh no, totally, you can turn your video back on. After that, we'll have a general wrap-up session. And as long as you raise your hand, then I can unmute you, then you can speak. So I will assign you now into the breakout rooms. We will not have too many, I promise. And then after that, we will return and have our wrap-up. So let's see if this works. Okay, and we are all returning into the main room now for our general discussions. I think we're still waiting for a few people who are in the breakout rooms, and then will join us all here to discuss their thoughts on the culture and wisdom section. Just give it a few more seconds. Okay, I think we are coming all back to our main room. And now we have time for general discussion with everybody. Also, we can continue using the chat function, as well as if you want to still post your notes on the Padlet, the breakout room discussion, to provide a summary of what you discussed, you're welcome to do so now during the next 20 minutes or so. So I would like to first raise the question if there are any comments from the individual sessions. You had about 10 minutes or so to discuss among yourselves the various questions. And maybe some of you would like to comment on behalf of the group what you reflected on what you found most interesting or most challenging. If so, please raise your electronic hand by looking under the reactions, and then I will unmute you, and you can also then turn on your video if you want. Okay, so we have Emma, and I will unmute her. And Emma, if you want to turn on the video, here we go. All right.
Okay, I'll just briefly summarize maybe my perspective on our talk. So we had a very quick discussion about whether we should be looking for cultural differences in wisdom, because the one initial reaction was that it could be a kind of exoticism. Sorry, I'm trying to unraise my hand. All right, there we go. That we're just, it's exciting to look for differences. And so then we go looking for differences, but then we ignore that there's actually huge commonalities and that we don't study the commonalities. And I just wanted to put forth my cultural psychology perspective that I think that although we don't often, if we are really looking for commonalities, then this is actually something that came from Mark Trumbull. If we're looking for commonalities, then we are also looking for differences, because we are looking to find out what is the possible variety in wisdom concepts. And then we need to look across time, across cultures, across different, very, very different types of cultures to identify what the possible varieties are. And then we can figure out what the commonality is. But if we I think that what psychologists usually do is that we accidentally study one culture, whichever culture is the one that we happen to be sitting in, because we can get 600 people easily. And then that is going to be, that is the problem. So that's why I think that we we could look for commonalities, but if we want to look for the commonalities and emphasize that common humanity, we have to also look for cultural differences and just see what possibilities are out there.
Thank you so much, Emma. Yeah, it's a very valuable perspective, and like you, I find that it's tricky. We're tempted by differences because they seem more sensationalist. And yet at the same time, there may be some things in which one can also think about similarities. And then you're tempted one way or another, because one thing may be easier to publish than another in scientific discourse. And that's why maybe cross-cultural psychology has struggled, where the focus initially has been on finding similarities and establishing universality, and that was not as exciting of a finding as potentially looking at differences, which really brought it to the limelight, together with some, I would say, socioeconomic reasons in the late 80s and 90s. Okay, let's see if we have additional comments from others. Again, like, please raise your hand if you want to comment on something, or if you want to comment on general ideas about culture and wisdom. I saw a few people who privately texted me. You're welcome to sort of raise your hand, and then I will unmute you, and you can share your perspective. Let's see what other people have to say. I mean, and also I'm looking at the Padlet. There's a number of ideas, but I think it's all so far maybe coming from one group, group 5, which concerned commonalities and differences in wisdom across cultures, as we already just discussed.
Can I mention a related question, which is,
yeah, sure,
commonalities and differences in wisdom across sort of types of people? So, for example, people with autism or people with schizophrenia, as Diob Jesta has studied. I mean, I think that's also an interesting question. You know, even within a culture, we could imagine that there are varieties of people, and whether autism is something that is itself culture specific, or whether it has a universality, and the wisdom associated with it might also be universal.
Oh, that's a fascinating question. So what is your perspective on that? So if somebody who is schizophrenic recognizes some kind of a higher being, would you then claim that they have a different perspective on wisdom, or that they are schizophrenic?
I guess that it's something like, actually, I don't really know much about schizophrenia. I have more to say about autism, but just off the cuff, I would think it wouldn't be so much about, you know, for example, believing your own delusions as an example of wisdom, but it would be the ability to maybe manage those and in a way that improves your quality of life and the quality of life of people around you. So there are people that actually, like some founders of religious organizations, that if you just read certain, you know, parts of their life, sound like they could be schizophrenic, but yet somehow they manage to inspire, you know, thousands of people and really sort of be transformative leaders in their community. So I think in that sense, like, wisdom to me would be something like that, be able to marshal all these things that could topple many other people, but use them in a way that actually enhances your power, or your impact, or even your access to something deeply true. That's how I would like imagine myself. And I think you could say the same thing about autism. Like, so autism is famously people who have very sort of like low social skills, but it doesn't mean in other sort of writings about them, they're much more frank, they're much more sort of forthright in what they think. They're not as sensitive to what other people say about them, like Greta Thunberg as one instance. So I think there too is somebody who's able to sort of like, you know, take what otherwise would be a weakness and make it a strength. Say that could be a way in which wisdom manifests for you in a particular way that reflects your own sort of like characteristics, something like that. But that's my thought. I'd love to hear other people.
Right. So other perspectives on the topic of wisdom and mental health, which is could be a minefield, of course, but also could be a very, very interesting opportunity for understanding the neurodiversity and other ideas. I think Vivian has an idea, so let me unmute her. Vivian, please go ahead.
So our group was talking about the attributes of wisdom and the necessity, or as research has revealed, the affective, the empathy component, as well as the reflective component. And as a psychologist, after I left research on wisdom, most of my work afterwards was as a clinical neuropsychologist. I would have to say that there are certain types of personalities, like the narcissistic personality, where empathy is very, very minimal, or people who are very impulsive, maybe because they have ADHD and can't take the time to reflect all the elements that go into making decisions that bear some social impact. These particular types might be outliers on the continuum of capacity to develop wisdom time. So, you know, these were additional thoughts that came to me as I've been working clinically over the years. And I said that that early childhood experiment with the marshmallows, and, you know, the children who were able to delay picking up the marshmallow right away, and so they got a reward with 2 marshmallows, versus the children that got the marshmallow right away, they couldn't wait. Those are the children that should be studied developmentally, because their ability to take time, you know, might be a precursor to the necessary time it takes to reflect on all the complex components that go into some very important social level decisions. So that's what I want to add.
Thank you so much. Okay, and this is a fascinating perspective, especially the Walter Michel's and you should show this marshmallow studies and the complexity with how it unfolded for kids of different socioeconomic status as well. Definitely worth pursuing with more data and longitudinal research, as I also mentioned earlier today, with definitely much more investment in those type of studies, which is very hard to convince people to do, because those are longitudinal pieces of work that don't pay off with immediate publications. Okay, so let's see what other perspectives we have. Other groups or individuals that would like to comment on their discussions and or ideas that they had. Again, like, please raise your hand and we'll give you the opportunity to share. Okay, Melody, please go ahead.
So just want to make sure that I'm muted. So actually I was thinking along the same line of Emma's question about the impulsive, the marshmallow test. I think when I first learned about that, my first reaction about the marshmallow study was like, great, it's about the idea of gratification, it's good to wait. But then I guess as I see more and more conflict these days in different parts of the world, my question is also that, you know, yes, it's good to wait, have delay of gratification if you really expect that you will get something in return in the long run and get more in the long run. But then for people who are living in a context like that are very deprived of resources, would it be more, I don't know if we can use the word wise or adaptive, would it actually be more adaptive for people who are living in a deprived condition to actually really get whatever they have now in the moment, rather than just waiting and risking not getting anything? Because it kind of reminds me of a lot of the old time when there were starvation, people don't have enough food to eat, and it's a time where it's more about here and now, being able to feed everyone in the family now at this moment. So in that context, if we move the marshmallow study to a time when it's like at a wartime, when there are scarce resources, what does it mean to really delay the gratification and wait versus people who actually get whatever they have? So that's more like a question and reflection that I have. I don't have an answer to that. I kind of wonder what others think about that.
Thank you so much, Melody. And I think we have Samar who would like to speak up. So I will unmute Samar, and hopefully we can hear from them.
Hi, I just wanted to add that really got me thinking. We just talked about this in one of my classes last week, and for the marshmallow test, and they said that the reason that some kids immediately ate the marshmallow and didn't wait was because they didn't have stable house supports, and they had so they weren't given they came from low poverty houses and low income socioeconomic statuses. So when they saw the marshmallow, they ate it right away because they didn't have that stability at home. So research did actually show that that was the reason that a lot of the reasons that they could have had could have gave in right away.
Right. The relationship of the initial and the subsequent replication, so-called marshmallow studies, is complex and quite confounded with the socioeconomic status of the children. Thank you so much, Samar. We have another hand from Ankita Sharma, and I will unmute Ankita now so she can speak up.
Hello, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you. First of all, about marshmallow test, what I want to talk about is delayed gratification is mostly associated with patience, right? And we were talking about cultural context. So I would like to bring that here. So in Indian cultural context, patience is taken as a very important virtue. It is given a lot of emphasis. It is part of the general conversation that, you know, you should have patience or be patient. People who are patient, they get good things and all of that. So I was wondering that maybe this socioeconomic status we are talking about, maybe that will also be displayed differently depending upon certain strength and virtues, the way they are, you know, given weightage in a particular culture. So maybe it's much more complex. But personally, I would agree that delayed gratification as an inclination is important, or patience is important for a person to take a pause and reflect. And maybe that is essential for development of wisdom or wise behavior. And this wise behavior keeps coming back in all the discussions I'm having over chat or also over the breakout rooms. So maybe it is really a high time that we should also talk about wisdom in action. The way we are talking about common model for wisdom as a process, I don't know if we have something very specific on wisdom as behavior or wisdom in action. That would be something I would be really interested to know about and talk about. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Thank you so much, Ankita. Yeah, that's an important question. And we have been debating the question of whether we should be focusing more on behavior, whether we should be focusing more on outcomes. And now, behavior is not necessarily an outcome. You can define what kind of behaviors you want to look for without labeling them to be good outcomes, which is often the sort of a post hoc type of rationalization. But we can certainly talk about behaviors, for instance, as I brought up earlier today in the previous part of this summit, when you talk about intellectual humility, or when you talk about empathy, you can look at metacognitive characteristics, but you can also look at what people actually do, whether they in fact update their beliefs, and that's a form of behavior. You can look at it behaviorally, whether they will accept new information or seek out new information in case they don't know what they're doing. And for empathy, you can also look at other sort of physiological signatures and actual reactions towards other people, instead of just at perspective taking, which is a metacognitive ability, or some affective components. So absolutely. And we haven't spoken as much about it, potentially because, to use sort of Clark's language, there may be a bias that we have by internalizing a lot of the processes and being much less pragmatic about looking at what you can see observably. Instead of that, we are looking much more what we cannot see, the mental processes. but it certainly has been a discussion in the wisdom field for quite a while. And I think even after this summit, we'll have even more discussion on this topic. I see a hand from Jingsung, so I will unmute him next, and we'll see what he has to say.
Can't figure out how to put my hand down. Oh, well. So we've kind of been having this lively conversation in the chat for the last couple of hours, just on how historical conceptions of wisdom change over time, which we felt might also be an interesting thing to bring up. For example, the biggest one that I can think of off the top of my head is sometime around the Iron Age. Michel knows this better than I do, but we see this change from discussions of wisdom as a way to acquire kind of power in this world to discussions of wisdom as more having to do with the virtues. So this just ends up being this consistent problem that we see where conceptions of wisdom, even within a culture, change. And I think it might be worth having more conversations about that because, you know, I understand we're trying to understand wisdom at this kind of macro theoretical level of what's true for humanity at all times and all places, but there's a pretty good argument to be made that nothing's been true for humanity at all times and all places, except for maybe we need to eat and breathe.
Thank you so much, Jinsung. Let's see if they have additional comments from others. Hi, Magda. I think you raised your hand, so I unmuted you. Would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you. I think on this topic that we are discussing behaviors, also the specific applications of wisdom in different fields, medical field, education. We were discussing in our breakout room about a research Ellie did on nursing, the nurse. So I am wondering not only the cultural aspect, but also the field and the application. Thank you.
So I think you mean the application. Can you elaborate a little bit on when you say application of wisdom in different professional domains and how it will look like? Is that what you're referring to? I'm not sure if we can hear Magda right now.
If I could jump in.
Sure, go ahead, Michel.
I think it's in the same in the same spirit anyways, or at least it provoked this thought in me, is that it's true sometimes studies are about what is wisdom or how does wisdom develop? What resources do we need? And then maybe say along the lines of several things discussed so far at the conference, how does wisdom manifest in particular professions, in medical decisions, in you know, and you could imagine, you know, by lawyers, you know, say in different types of professional contexts, you know, that in which wisdom sort of like, you know, can be identified. How does it operate, or how does it operate perhaps differently or the same? I mean, that I think that is a really interesting question.
Yes, indeed. It is a fascinating question. I think we have representatives at this summit from different fields, including several professional communities. And I encourage those people who do come from different professional organizations to reach out to scholars and also potentially to form groups so that we can learn more about the role of wisdom in your communities. We would like to have more of that at the next summit potentially. Okay, let's see if we have any additional final roundup thoughts from the breakout discussions. I see one comment in the chat. Ankita Sharma mentioned, we discussed about morale. We talked about morality and wisdom before, and now the cultural aspect. in context of declining moral value in society, as some people say. However, what do we have on teaching morals and ethics in culture-specific ways, if we accept that wisdom and morality are indeed related? Melody, Michel, or others care to comment?
I kind of feel like this is a tricky question because in the sense, I think there is, I guess it's kind of a bit of a scatter thought, because it kind of remind me of one of the comment in a small group breakout room discussion that we kind of need to balance between saying things that are universal versus saying things everything is cultural specific. Then if everything is cultural specific, where to draw the boundary? And it occurred to us in the discussion that a lot of the understanding that we thought universal might only be very limited to a specific population that we study. We actually know very little about culture, other culture. I think we kind of go back to the weird discussion about how most of the study and research and things we know about morality and culture, we talk a lot about that. We spend whole morning on this issue, but then it kind of made me wonder about how much of this, how much do we really know after all? Like, we seem to know a lot, but then it seems that this a lot that we know is very specific to certain population group. We actually know very little about other cultural groups. So I find it, so that's why I find it very hard to find an answer to this question about how to teach about morality and whether we should teach morality in a culture-specific way. I don't have an answer to that, but I kind of feel like it kind of open up the discussion of what do we know. We feel like it seems as if we know a lot, yet we know very little, and what we know can be very specific, and we actually don't know what we don't know at this point. So that's kind of the reaction that I have.
It's actually a very important point to me personally, given the limits and bounds of the current scientific evidence. I would be very hesitant at providing some sweeping recommendations for educational reforms or practices, in part because of challenges of figuring out what could be most effective. And the effective always depends on the term effective depends on the type of goal you're trying to achieve, which is always culturally embedded, and consequently cannot be claimed in general, in my opinion. So I would therefore emphasize the metacognitive components in which you, you would not necessarily focus just on the particular values, but how you process them, on the ethical deliberations about them. Okay, let's see if we have any additional thoughts or comments from others. The final thoughts from anybody?
I think Igor froze at the moment he maybe invited me. So I'll just very quickly. I was wondering how comfortable different wisdom researchers would be in saying that wisdom might not develop in certain cultures. So we've been discussing the marshmallow situation again, and I was thinking of other ones as well, elements of wisdom. So for example, if we have social contexts where patience is not adaptive, and it's consistently not adaptive, then people should not, if we ask people what is wise, they might not identify patience and waiting as an element of wisdom. But then wisdom researchers might say, therefore, people in this culture are not wise. That in fact people here are not wise, that this group of people can't develop true wisdom. And I'm thinking, my question that I raised last night about particularism, where I think that a wise person needs to ignore their sense of sympathy. And so then maybe in cultures where more and more it's becoming important to stick to one's principles instead of being sympathetic, and that would then be the wise, how people would identify wiseness is actually ignoring sympathy. So I'm wondering how would you be happy to completely adapt the definition of wisdom to things like not adopting other perspectives and not waiting, or therefore allow different cultures to define what wisdom means? Or would you prefer to say, look, wisdom has to involve perspective taken, it has to involve being able to control impulses, and therefore some cultures, people might be unable to develop wisdom?
It's a big question, Emma, and I would say almost famous last words, because we are at the end of this session, and I promised to Nick, who is finally going to announce the awards for our Flash Talks. Some people are waiting for a long time to hear those that I will pass it on to him. But we will return to those questions of morality, culture, and probably particularism again in the future. This is just the first Wisdom Summit that we ever had, and I'm hoping that this will not be the last one. But I will return to that in a second. First, I will pass it on to Nick, who will introduce the award winners.
There we go. Can everyone hear me? Great.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks, Igor. Well, I have the happy news. I get to be the deliverer of good news today, and that is to award 3 particular Flashtalk presenters with a financial prize, which was donated generously by the Center for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago. And one of their representatives is here with us. Jean, I see you just popped your video on. So nice to see you. Thanks for being here. So we were donated a main prize, which is valued at $100, and it'll be in the form of a gift card that makes sense in the context of wherever the winner lived, as well as 2 honorable mentions for $50 each. I'm also going to pop into the chat the link to the Center for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago, because if you don't follow their newsletter, you absolutely should. It's how I stay connected to the world of wisdom, and I look forward to their emails which come at a regular basis. So we would like to recognize for the main award, a presentation titled "Mind the Gap, Wisdom Attenuates a Male Bias toward Gender Pay Gap Denialism." And this was presented by Anna Dorfman. And Anna, I don't think is with us right now, because Anna is probably fast asleep, as she should be, in Israel at the moment. But this was a fantastic presentation on an important topic. And despite technical glitches in the presentation, still managed to be very compelling. And it's a fantastically designed study on top of that. So that's the main award. We're very happy to present that to Anna. And there are 2 honorable mentions. The first honorable mention, in no particular order other than alphabetical, goes to a talk titled "Translational Relation of Wisdom and Transformational Leadership, Exploring Conceptualization and Prediction." And that was by Abhishek Sharma and Kita Sharma as well, who I think are both here in the audience right now. So congratulations to you both. That was a fantastic talk, a very rich study with multiple methods that we can't wait to see how it unfolds. And finally, the last honorable mention goes to a talk titled "Wisdom Resources as Protection Against Conspiracy Beliefs" by Andreas Scherp from the University of Klagenfurt. And Andy was here at the beginning of the afternoon session or the evening session and held out, I think, as long as he could, but now has retired as well. So congratulations to Andy. Jean will be in touch with you. We've already provided your information to her, and we look forward to seeing these threads of research develop and evolve.
Thank you so much, Nick, and congratulations again, Andy and Anna and Abhishek. Thank you so much for your presentations. And thank all of Flashtalk presenters. We had a wonderful collection of cutting edge insights, both in the first part of this summit as well as right now. And now I will just close. And I have a little presentation. So let me just, okay. Let me just share with you some additional insights. So we are coming to the end of our 2021, the first International Wisdom Summit. And today we had scholars from all over the world, from Australia, New Zealand, China, Philippines, India, Europe, Great Britain, and the Americas join us virtually to discuss the present state of the science of wisdom and related fields. And the field of wisdom science can truly look to bright days ahead. We have already seen from the Flash Talks the very stimulating new developments. We've seen also that there's still a lot of very deep and important questions that we all need to address. And the moment for wisdom research appears to be now, with interest from philosophy, from cognitive and behavioral sciences, neuroscience, computer science, education, economics, and socioeconomic development studies, all kind of converging on the topics: what is wisdom? How can we use it? How can we apply it? And let me just highlight a few initiatives in case you're interested in wisdom, some of which you heard already from today and from the keynotes, and may want to keep an eye on in the future, because this is certainly just the tip of the iceberg for wisdom research. The first project that I would like to feature, and it was featured in one of our keynotes by Barrett, comes from the International Consortium of Anthropologists, Philosophers, and Social Scientists interested in the cross-cultural insights on knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And it's a major undertaking with a lot of exciting insights coming out probably very soon. Please stay tuned and check out their website. You will see a lot of interesting ideas and approaches to this very complex topics. On the more practical side, I would really like to highlight this fascinating project by Deepak Ramola from India, who is collecting life lessons from 195 countries of the world, combining documentation, arts, and education. And again, I would really encourage you to check out the worldwisdommap.com to learn more about it. It's a fascinating set of collections and just amazing what you can find in this treasure trove of insights. How about wisdom over the pandemic? I already mentioned this earlier in some of my remarks. Here I would like to draw your attention to the World After COVID project. So over the course of the last year, I interviewed 57 of the world's top social scientists and crisis management scholars. I asked them to reflect on the consequences of the pandemic, make some predictions, and also reflect on the type of wisdom we all need to prevent the negative, sustain the positive, and so on. And I encourage you to check out their interviews on the interactive website that we set up. It is a life history document of scientists' hopes and worries during the earlier phases of the pandemic last year. And I hope you will appreciate the interesting insights people had during the first phase of the pandemic and what they thought may be happening next. Another exciting initiative very soon is the Machine Wisdom Workshop at the University of Pittsburgh this coming year. So far, it is planned to be live, and organizers aim to offset travel costs for early career scholars. The deadline for submissions to the conference is February 8th. And the list of keynotes and further information is on their website, which is the machinewisdomproject.org. So check it out. Again, we had some questions about wisdom and AI, and this is one of the projects that tries to make this happen. Not necessarily the wisdom in AI in reality, but at least the theoretical and scientific discussion about them. And that's not all. So the pandemic put our plans on hold. We're still hoping to put together a Pan-Asian Wisdom Summit, which was supposed to happen if not for the pandemic. And so stay tuned for the new research at the intersection of morality and wisdom and culture at this conference, which will happen at the other side of the globe, hopefully still in Sri Lanka, and it will be either end of next year or in early 2023. And I would also like to highlight a few more features. If you're interested in the ongoing science of wisdom, check out the section of the summit website, wisdomsummit.uwaterloo.ca/talks-conference-materials, which feature recent empirical papers recommended by you in the pre-summit survey. There's a whole range of new and exciting developments, and we've profiled those that you recommended on the conference website. As Nick pointed out, you may consider signing up for the newsletter from the Center for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago. And here's the link, just very easy, wisdomcenter.uchicago.edu/contact-us. Just put your name down and you will be receiving a monthly newsletter or bi-weekly newsletter, depending how you choose. And in case you want to listen to less formal discussions on all things wisdom, consider subscribing for the podcast hosted by Charles Cassidy and myself on the topic of wisdom on wisdompodcast.com. We'll give you all insights, wisdom, and certainly the insights about the World After COVID project that we have been covering over the course of the last year. Lots of individuals have been involved to realize this conference, this summit, and you have seen and heard from some of them throughout today. I want to thank particularly Padina for designing our logo, Helen, Kiana, and Jean for organizational instructional support for the website and promotion, Olga, Jane, Konstantinos, and Harley for coding open-ended survey results from the pre-summit survey. I also want to thank Nick in particular for doing such a terrific job at chairing the Flash Talks and organizing and managing it, and Harvard for chairing the roundtable early on, Melody, Justin, and Michel for their guidance throughout, and finally, to the amazing list of keynote presenters and panelists for our event. And once again, I would like to thank the University of Waterloo for providing virtual hosting support, and members of the Wisdom and Culture Lab, members of the Wisdom and Identity Lab of the Ontario Institute for Studies of Education for helping with all the related information, the University of Chicago, particularly Center for Practical Wisdom, and the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada for providing me with an opportunity to do whatever I want related to wisdom, including this conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. And that was all and the wrap for our 2021 Wisdom Summit. Thank you so much for being here.